So we're just going to keep using that same set. Go to section 4. You're there? Excellent. Good stuff. Okay. So what I'm going to do here in this last session is I want to leave you some practical steps, things to consider, and then we'll have probably some extended Q&A because we didn't get to do that last time. So I'm gonna probably keep this a little shorter than I probably otherwise would have, but that should be fine. We're gonna be okay. Okay, so again, what I want to do is, I'm encouraging you to consider the big possibilities and the fact that whether you are prepared to lead your church there or not, and Greg and I were having this discussion just prior to coming in here previously, and I think there is a point that I think we're all recognizing the church is going to look different in the coming decades, and maybe with the pandemic that we've just gone through, that'll be accelerated more quickly than we all anticipated. But it will look different. Now, I guess it's easier if you're older, and here I'm starting to look at retirement here. I'm thinking, well, I'll be long gone by the time a lot of this stuff is fully implemented. But I don't want to just wait around for that either. I want to, or just shrug it off to the next generation. I want to be involved in whatever way that I can to do whatever God has called me to do, to help, to inspire, and even for Kathy and I, as we're looking at moving and retiring, we see missional community as ourselves developing oikos within our own family and within our own settings. We believe that God has called us to be missionaries wherever He places us. And so it's going to be important for us to incorporate that into our own lives, whatever that looks like. So I think there's possibilities for all of us. It's just leading the stuff within the church is difficult. And I know that as you're wrestling with this, and I know I've already had a few conversations with a few of you, where you recognize that you just can't flip a switch on this stuff. It's hard. And there's a lot of work that has to go into this. It's challenging, but it's worth it. It's worth it to struggle through this, even if it takes your congregation 10 years to do it. It would be worth it to begin the process. So again, I'm not here to sell you anything. I just want you to be. I wanted to present to you a challenge, something that. A vision for what this could look like. But in the end, you've got to discern where God is leading you. That being said, I did promise, and this is what we're going to kind of focus on, is what are some things that you can take home with you from all of this? So let's start with that, and then we'll move into Q&A. So the first step I want you to look at, and we've talked about this already, but I'm going to kind of drill down on this right now from a practical point of view, is really intentionally focus on how you can provide the 4 spaces, whatever that looks like. And if necessary, collaborate with other churches, because I think that, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but really be thinking that strategically. Look at everything you do in the church and say, how does it fit into the 4 spaces? Now, again, it's not like you've got to map it out equally, 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. But be intentional. Recognize the way that people are wired psychologically and the way people react and interact within social settings, and that's going to help you a lot. And I think if you recognize that, people, even though people in your congregation may not even be able to articulate any of this, they feel it. They really sense it and feel it. And if you honor that, they will respond. Because we talked this morning about the fact that sometimes we violate the contract that we have with people in different social settings. And when we do that, we get ourselves into trouble. because they come with certain expectations, and then we switch and bait, or bait and switch. Sorry, when did I say switch and bait? Bait and switch, and that's not, and that's just not healthy on a lot of different levels. So what does that look like? So I think part of it is, so start with what you have. Start with the programs that you're already running in your church. You look at them and say, where do they fit? Maybe draw a chart and say, where do we have public space, social space, personal space, intimate space. And then really define how you're doing with those. Make sure you're not violating those spaces. So take your worship setting as an example. When you are together, say on Sunday morning, and you are treating it as a public space, just be careful not to put people in positions where they feel like they've been forced to become uncomfortable in ways that just might not be appropriate. Again, some people are not going to, and some people may not even be able to state it with words, but they feel it. And I think the more we can be sensitive to that, the better. So really work on those 4 spaces. And as I said earlier, I think the opportunity for us is in that area of social space. Think of ways that you can incorporate social space within your church. And if you are a small church, already in that 20 to 50 range, celebrate that. Say, we've got social space. But then start functioning like social space. Don't, be a social space church and then try to live in public space. Or maybe even personal space. Just know what lane you're in, and make sure you're driving there. And if you create other spaces, make sure people understand the different options that they're being exposed to. I think people will respond if they know ahead of time what's expected of them and the space that you're providing. They're going into it with eyes wide open. I think you're going to feel that they respond better. Okay, so I think one of them is just, if you are blessed with this knowledge after today, if that's the only thing you remember, if after today everything else is a fog and a blur, but this space thing gets you thinking, I think that can be really helpful for you as a congregation. Okay, so that's number 1. So let's go to number 2. Which I guess I already kind of went there, but really focus on mid-sized groups. So let's talk a little bit more about the social space aspect of this. I really believe, whether or not you go to the full, you start calling them missional communities, whether you go with the full-blown proposal that I had given you earlier, find ways to incorporate that within your church. Because you will be blessed by it significantly. You're going to find that it's going to strengthen your body. It's also going to be, if you do it appropriately, it could be ways that new people can enter into your church. I think that could be one of those front doors that people can enter into your church through. Now, I got to share this with you because I didn't write this down, but I was thinking about this last night. And in fact, when I was driving back last night, this occurred to me. One place in the church we do really good at social space. And I want you to hear this. This might be a model for you to consider. But one of the places we're good at in social space is in youth ministry. Now, unless you have a really small church with a really small youth group. But that's one place we have allowed, and we've encouraged social space settings. Because if you have a youth group, say of 20 kids, you're functioning, and of course, you know what youth groups are like, right? I mean, youth groups are, you're all youth at one point, hopefully. And I know there's some of you are youth pastors, you know how this works, but you know what? You do a lot of fun stuff with youth, right? I mean, there's an opportunity, and one of the reasons kids love youth group is because of the fact that they get to live life together in so many different ways. And sometimes it's just fun stuff and crazy stuff. And sometimes it's serious stuff and so forth. But that's what kids love that. And then, of course, we make them grow up and become adults, and we don't provide for them social spaces that they can function in. You ever think about that? Kids, I remember this. I was a youth pastor. That was my first vocational ministry job. I was a youth pastor, actually, in my home church that I grew up in. And it used to bother me significantly and we had a great youth group. I mean, we had a growing youth group. It was large. It was, to this day, I have connections with some of those kids, and some of them have gone on to do some amazing things, and some of them are not Christians when they first came to the youth group. But I'm so thankful for that ministry. But it bothered me because there were some kids that as soon as they hit, they graduated from high school, we didn't know what to do with them. And we lost a number of them because we tried to, you couldn't really keep them around the youth group too long because they were really starting, they were getting older and they didn't want to be with the younger kids. And we tried some college and career programs, that didn't work. And we couldn't incorporate them into the adults. The adults were too stuffy and it was difficult. But man, we lost them because if we would have had a social space setting already in place, if the church was already breathing this and living this on a regular basis, they could have just flowed into that naturally. In fact, our youth groups could flow into that, could be part of that. We could have more multi-generational stuff. I think there's so many opportunities that are there, but we've allowed the youth to do it. But maybe some of us adults need to get into that as well. So there's a thought for you. But that's an example of how a social space can work itself out within the life of the church. And I think part of it is to value and measure. So, we were talking earlier when I was showing the difference between a centralized ministry that's focused on the Sunday morning worship experience versus one that is more decentralized, where you have missional communities that would be your primary expression of church life. I think one of the ways we get there is by what we value and what we measure. And so what are you as a pastor even, or as a leader within your congregation, what are you looking at as a way to determine whether your church is healthy? Are you still measuring butts and pews? Is that the thing that's the ultimate measurement of whether your church is successful? Or when you're talking, are you telling stories of and even the language that you're using in the church? Is it all about how many people show up on a Sunday morning? Or is it, are you telling stories of, I invited someone to church on Sunday? Which again, none of that's bad. But what if we start changing the values and we start projecting a different story, which has to do with we value relationships. We value the fact that we're connected in life-on-life type relationships. And that we're measuring that, we're telling stories about that. Your church will pick up on what you value and what you measure. And if all the focus is on what you're valuing and measuring on Sunday morning, they're not going to really hear. They may hear that you think it's important that they do other things, but they don't think that's really important. So how you communicate that becomes really essential. So focus on mid-sized groups. Find some way to. So it's similar to what I was saying earlier about the 4 spaces, but I want you to especially grapple with this one. And find what's going to work in your setting. I think you're going to find that can make a significant difference. Okay, number 3. Think hubs. I think there's some great possibilities. Like we had the table I was at lunch, we were talking a little bit about this, and I shared a little bit of some of the hub thinking that we're doing right now in Washington State, or in our district. But I think there is tremendous potential here. So let me give you an example. One is for small churches, and again, we mentioned this before, had some discussion of this at lunch, but I want to encourage you. Small churches, don't do it alone. find ways to band together with other churches, and maybe even consider becoming a hub-based church. So you're one church that meets in different locations, and you allow those different locations to flourish and find their unique expression within those communities. Because remember, it's not about control, top-down control. It's allowing these different entities in their different locations to find unique expression. So I think what we're afraid of when we do this type of thing is we're afraid that this is like McDonald's, we're franchising, everybody's got to be the same. It's not like that. It's if you want to have 3 or 4 different churches, say small churches, come together. What if you just became one church? Like literally on paper become one church that meets in 4 different locations. You share a common leadership core, you share some common internal responsibilities like your finances, all your money can be handled together, and you could delineate out so that to make sure that there's money designated for a particular location that it's handled at that location. But there's efficiencies that you could handle in that way. And there's things like, say, if you want to start a youth ministry, instead of each of you having trying to do a youth ministry where you only have 1 or 2 youth, you pull together and take those 1 or 2 youth that each of you have, and you get 6, 7, 8. Even if you had that, you'd have a bigger youth group than you have now, and you have a way of getting it started. I mean, why do we, and I know why, we've done it in the past, but why do we feel like we have to persist with fully autonomous churches that have to be independent from each other, and we can't find ways to work together? And then we can say, yeah, well, we'll cooperate, we'll work together. But I think you will be so much healthier if you're willing to release a little bit more of yourself and say, we're going to join together formally, but we're still going to retain our unique local expression. See, I think what people are afraid of is that they're going to become, again, this is where the McDonald's thing, they're going to become, XYZ church, and you're all going to carry the same logo and the same branding, and you're going to lose the unique identity that you have at that location. What if you release that and say, no, we can, if we go with this hub model, we can actually, we can become one church and create a central hub that we're part of and operating out of, but we retain our unique identity, because and the reason you need unique identity at the local level, because that's your mission. Because what needs to happen in one city is going to look different than it's going to happen in another city. And I think there might even be more openness to that. Otherwise, people don't want to they don't want to give up what they have and what they've invested in, but there are ways you can structure that to preserve the intent of the past and the value of ministry in a particular location, but coming together, you can do that. And with the exception of maybe like Santa Maria, and I use them as an example because they're the far-flung church way out there, right? The one that's out in the fringes. We love Santa Maria, but they're unfortunately geographically they're a little more removed. But for the most part, most of the churches here in Central California, you guys have an advantage of being really close to each other in proximity. You have that opportunity. Where I'm in, we're doing that because of technology. We're doing some of that in my area, in the Pacific Northwest. But I have a district. My district, from one end to the other, is 600 miles. And so it's hard to connect churches over a 600-mile distance. You guys, I remember when I was pastoring here, at that point, I'm not sure if you guys still do. In fact, I know you don't do it now because of COVID. I know it's been probably more difficult as people have been bivocational. But we used to have pastors' meetings every week, every month. It was a Tuesday at noon, I can't remember, whatever, first, second Tuesday of the month or something. We used to do that on a regular basis, and we had great participation because geographically you could do that. In my district, that would never work, ever. At least not physically. Now with technology, you can do that. But you get my point. I hope I'm not just rambling, but I think so if you're a small church, consider banding together. And not just, we'll cooperate, twice a year we'll do something together. But what if you're really, really seriously considered forming a formal hub. That could just be revolutionary on so many levels. Now, what if you're a large church? Well, you have an opportunity as well, but on a whole different level, because you already have the infrastructure, you already have things in place. What if you became a hub? In two ways. There's two ways you can become a hub. One is if you're going to form missional communities and you go that route, you already have the infrastructure to be a really good hub for these social size groups that are out there. But what if you were to adopt or take in a small church that was near you, or that you know, there's probably some affinity, and you became a hub for them. Allow them to still function, but they become part of you, and you honor the best of their localized ministry, but you offer them the strengths that you have with the resources that you have to offer. And as long as they don't see it as a takeover, as long as they don't see it as the big brother trying to control our destiny, I think some of them approached the right way could really benefit significantly from that. And I know we're doing that in our district. I don't want to just tell you about stories from where I am, but we've seen in our district a lot of pastoral turnover in the last few years. Right now in our district, which has 47 churches plus, we have 10 churches without lead pastors.
Wow.
And in fact, we had one pastor who died October, I think it was. And that particular church, as an example, they're in a small community. I mean, they're a small church, and they're in a small community that's going to be really hard for them to attract a pastor. Really difficult. And so what they started to do on their own, which actually turned out to be an opportunity, because they didn't have access to preaching, they just started pulling sermons off the internet from wherever. Somebody said, let's pull off from this church here, we'll just watch a sermon every Sunday, because we can do worship, but we don't have anybody who can preach. So I talked to them and said, you know what, just 45 minutes away from you have one of our largest churches. Why don't you try their sermons, and then you'd have a consistent, and it'd be Church of God, and they're close, they're in the same county, you might instead of getting somebody from South Carolina that you're watching, why don't you get somebody that's local, and maybe somebody that you could maybe talking about some of the same issues that you're familiar with. So they started doing that, and that got them going. And then I said to them, well, why don't you develop a partnership with them, and maybe consider just becoming you can still retain your location here, but becoming basically a satellite partner of theirs. And they're in that discussion right now. They're excited about it. I was in some ways surprised, but also very excited, because they might not have considered that 2 years ago. But because of the pandemic and the willingness to even look at things digitally, they're thinking, maybe that is a good option. So they're working on a partnership with one of our larger churches, and our larger church is incorporating that already into their sermons, so that when they're doing the sermons on Sunday, the pastor says, hey, I just want to reach out, we want to shout out to our sister church in Morton, Washington, and I want to say hi to you, and we're glad that you're with us this morning. Just a little gesture like that is a reminder to them that this little church matters and is part of this bigger church's ministry. So, anyways, for what it's worth, it's just an idea. Larger church, what if you became a hub? And started to in a non-threatening, non-takeover way, begin to look at ways that you can partner with smaller churches. Okay, number 4. So this one I want to spend a little time on as well, because this is, question is, in fact I had this question posed to me at lunch, well, how do we do this? Aren't people going to resist if you say, hey, try this missional community thing that seems so overwhelming and so all-encompassing? That could be really difficult. And I get that. I totally get that. And that's why I keep giving you all these disclaimers that I'm not here to sell you this, it's going to take time, and blah, 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 blah. But how do you start implementing this stuff? Again, don't just say, well, on March 1st, we're moving to this new model, we're throwing out all the good things we've done in the past and we're going to try something new. That's not going to go over good. Unless you're ready to retire and you're ready to move on in ministry, don't do it, okay? Just don't do it. Stop it. But what you can do is start by running a pilot. Find some leaders who are eager and who maybe see the vision for this and say, what if we were to try something? And let's work on this together. And all it would take, say if you were to try something like a missional community, if you could get, say, close to 20 people and start doing this in your church, just try it. Just try. Say, we're going to try it for 6 months. We're going to just see how it goes. We're going to give them all the resources and training they need to get started. We're going to try it, and then we'll come back and we'll reflect on it. You're going to find out, number one, if it's going to work in your setting. But as you do have success, and I believe in many cases you won't always. There will be failures. There will be times where it will falter. But hopefully you'll learn from those experiences as well. That as these things begin to take off, then you have stories to tell to your church, and you have ways of conveying the vision for this. And then other people might jump on board and say, well, I love what they're doing. Can we be part of this as well? So start small. Don't feel that you have to change everything up like right now. I think there are ways that you can begin to implement new programs, new visions without disrupting the culture that you have. Because we want to honor what God has already put in place. I'm not here to criticize the specific things that you were doing, because I know that God is at work in every one of your situations. It's not a matter is what you're doing is wrong. It's more a matter of, is what we're doing fully realizing the vision that God has for our church. And so I would hope that you're willing to see that, and maybe a place to start is just to say, let's run some pilots. But if you do it, if you set up a pilot, then, as I was saying, make sure that you set it up well. Don't just turn someone loose and say, well, let's just try this, and I don't know how to do it, but let's just wing it. No, don't do that, okay? Like, really go into it intentionally, get the training that is required, the expertise, make sure that the people leading it, maybe you need to be the one starting to lead it, to model it, but make sure you know what you're doing and the people leading it know what they're doing as well. It would be a disaster, because if you do it wrong and you have a failure, then it'll never happen again. You want to build this up with as much success as possible. So in order to do that, it's really important that you lay the groundwork. And it might mean not starting right away. Don't leave this conference thinking, well, we're going to start a missional community in April, we're going to do a pilot. No, April's not soon enough. Maybe September. By the time you get everything in place, then there may be some ways that you could do that. So I would say start thinking of pilots, and whether it's missional communities, whatever it is, think experimentation. Are any of you familiar with the term skunk works? Is that a term that I think that a few of you might have heard this from the business world? This was a term that the business writer Tom Peters really brought to the forefront. He didn't invent the term, but he observed it, and I forget which company it was that originally incorporated this, but Tom Peters talked about building skunk works into your operations. And I'll explain what a skunk works is. A skunk works was a name given to a part of an organization that was allowed to experiment and try new things. And in this particular company where this was done, they called it the Skunk Works. And this part of the business was empowered to think outside the box, allow new things to develop, and to actually implement them, even if they were to fail. And I think I don't think in the church we just throw stuff against the wall to see if it sticks. I don't think that's right. I think we go into things with prayer and discernment. But sometimes we have to step out in faith. And like the parable of the talents, I think sometimes we've got our talents, We've got them buried in the ground and we're afraid to touch them. Maybe there's a point where we just start needing to expend them and to trust God and to see where God leads us. Because even if it fails, we're going to learn things in the process. And what if you were, and so here's a big thing. So pastors, I'm talking to you in particular, but other church leaders who are here as well. Sometimes we're afraid of empowering people to try new things. Because we want control, we just want to make sure nothing goofy happens. And I get that. That's a whole discussion we could have on that whole topic as well. But I think the maturity and the trust that we would give our people to say, hey, if God's at work, we're going to allow you to see where this goes, and we're going to support you in that process. That could be tremendous. But I think sometimes we're in the church, we don't create an environment that allows for innovation. And innovation, I think the Holy Spirit is all about innovation. The Holy Spirit is all about taking us places we haven't been before. But sometimes I think we stifle the Holy Spirit because it's like, well, I'm not comfortable with that, so I'm not going to do it. Where God's trying to say, I want to take you new places, new territory. Let's try some new things. So anyway, just some ideas, but run some pilots, try some new things with some of the things that we've been talking about today. Okay, I'm going to recommend to you a few books. If you're wanting to pursue any of these topics, I think there's 3 books I would recommend. If you're looking at the whole thing of decentralization and how missional communities might fit in, I think a really good book on that topic is The Church as Movement by J.R. Woodward and Dan White Jr. I know J.R. Woodward personally, and this book is really good, so I'd encourage you to take a look at that. I think you'll find some of the things in there to be really helpful. If you're interested in the whole idea of social dynamics, I mean, you could go back and read the Edward Hall stuff, but that's not really church specific, but if you're geeky, you might enjoy that. But the book that is written about this from a church perspective is The Search to Belong by Joseph Myers. And that book, he deals with the whole thing of social dynamics and takes the Edward Hall material and lays it out more exhaustively. There's a few areas in which I disagree with Myers, but that's okay. I disagree with almost everything I read anyways, but to a certain point. But if you're interested in the topic, I would definitely take a look at that book. And if you're interested in the underground, I talked about in Tampa, there's a couple of books out that they published, but the one I think that you might find most helpful to start with is a book called Underground Church by Brian Sanders. Brian Sanders was the primary founder of the Underground, and he tells the story of the Underground. I think you'd find it interesting. He's also written another book since then called Microchurches, which has to do more with some of the philosophy and implementation behind them. But I would start with this book. And if you're really interested in the Underground thing, just contact me and I'll let you know. There is a documentary that was, it's available online, it's like a 25-minute documentary, that was done on the Underground, telling their story, and it is really powerful, really powerful. If you want the link for it, just let me know. And if you want to get a hold of me, this is my email address. I mean, you can use this now, or especially after, well, we're going to the next screen. There you go, thank you. This will be my email address that I'll be using predominantly.
Whoa, missionalcommunities.org?
Yeah.
How long ago did you get that? That's worth a lot of money.
I'm not selling it to you, so. But anyways, that's my email address, and so will be the one that I will use predominantly. So definitely reach out to me there if you have any questions or want to banter about it. Of course, you may see me around from time to time as well. Okay, so I wanted to leave enough time. I want to focus on Q&A. Because we didn't get to do it last time, and so I cut short. Hopefully the practical stuff was helpful, some takeaways, stuff that hopefully will be helpful for you. But let's just interact a little bit more, because I really want to hear your questions and maybe your objections to some of this too. I'm not afraid to, I'm not here to you don't like what I presented, that's fine. I don't have to defend myself, but I certainly would love to hear some of your thoughts on any of this as well. Perfect. Go.
So just to clarify, when you're talking about the missional communities, that 20 to 50 range, and if your church is already in that age or that range, so you wouldn't really have, how would you have a pilot of 10? Or would you think more of, let's just do that, so with the service, we can just change it to a whole missional community type? Or would you do like one Sunday, maybe break your Sundays that way, or just, I guess that's
Great question. Great question.
Kind of,
Totally good. Yeah, so if you're a church already in that size, it's a little different. You're not going to be piloting a new program, but what you are piloting is a change of expectations and culture within your congregation. Because there are people that then will bristle against any change to the way you do things. We haven't done it this way before, all the famous last words. So what you would do in that case, as far as piloting would be concerned, would be to maybe introduce it, say once a month we're going to change up the way we meet and introduce a new way of doing it, so that you're not being totally disruptive at first. So that's how you would pilot. So you're in other words, part of the idea of a pilot is you're giving people a chance to taste it, but you're being upfront to say, the commitment level, you don't have to give 100% right now. But we want you at least to give it a shot. So I would introduce it gradually. But but just in general, as far as what would a small church do to transition to a missional community? I think there's some tremendous potential there. And I think what you would want to do is change the nature of how you meet. Certainly, part of it is even, we're talking about how you arrange the chairs, which sounds so simplistic, but are you in rows or are you in a large circle? I would do things like, for example, the missional community that I'm part of right now in our church in Yakima, well, when we meet in person, which we've been doing more of, we've had a resurgence of COVID in our areas that we haven't for a few weeks, but we have a meal together. Every time we meet together in person, there's a meal. Because it's over food and over the table where we get to know each other and most of the time we're just talking stuff, sports and how the grandkids doing and what's happening in the world. But that's fine, but that's how we get to know each other. But we do that, that's just part of our rhythm. And I think you can do that. Now again, there are some people that's going to be disturbing because they want a bigger church experience. And so that's why it goes back to the other piece of then address that by finding the public space times when you can meet that need. And that doesn't mean you can't worship. Again, I remember I said earlier, we've lost our imagination for worship. There are ways we can worship in smaller settings that are meaningful, that don't try to pretend we're something we're not. But recognize there is a need for public space, so look for ways maybe of hubbing together or collaborating with some other churches or something to do that. So I don't know if that helps. But.
Can you have small groups that become missional communities?
Great question. Oh, that's a really good question. Anything's possible. I mean, seriously, it is. I would just say generally from my experience, it's difficult. For the reasons that I gave earlier. And even saying that, I'm not even sure if that's the right tactic. Because by doing that, then you're giving up the value of what the small group offers. So again, I'm not against small groups. I think there's a place for them. It's just that we have to realize small groups have limitations of what they can deliver. So instead of saying, should we transition small groups into missional communities, you could say, let's take whatever small groups we have and find ways to build on them so that we can have missional communities as well, so they can become part of a missional community. In fact, I would think that a small group could become the core of a missional community. In fact, if I had time, I'd love to share with you, and we won't do that today, and maybe if we do this this call thing. I'll introduce you what's called the Gooder funnel, which I know is going to totally sound really boring, but Daryl Gooder, who was probably the person who really conceptualized the whole idea of missional communities, has this diagram. It's a funnel. I call it the Gooder funnel. And at the core of that, and again, I know I'm boring you to death with technicalities, but it's a fascinating discussion because at the core of a healthy missional community, you need a core of really committed followers of Christ. So you need, it's like you want to think of it from an organism point of view. It's like a cell in the body or a cell in any living tissue. The nucleus of the cell is critical. So if you just got a bunch of people who are together, who like to hang out together, so that's fine. But if there's not some people there with spiritual maturity at the core, it's not going to go anywhere. So what you want to do is make sure that maybe that small group, maybe using them as a building block to build a missional community around them. And that gets into all sorts of discussions, which I didn't want to get into here either, but what are called bounded sets and centered sets. Are any of you familiar with that language? Fascinating discussion. In fact, there's a new book that just came out on this topic that, in fact, I've ordered it, but I don't even think it's been fully published yet, but fascinating discussion. And it has to do with how do we incorporate new people into the church and as they follow Christ and all this kind of stuff. Fascinating stuff. I know I'm probably boring you to death, but I would say don't worry about transitioning them as much as building upon the small groups.
Throughout history, you see the church has influenced the culture.
Yeah.
And now it seems like the culture is influencing the church. And it seems like we're acquiescing to the culture. And that may be a good thing, it may not be. Are you using this model we're talking about today so the church can be in a position to influence the culture?
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. That's really good. Oh man, I love that topic because I fully. One of the things I didn't get to share with you, part of one of the convictions that I have in all of this, is that this is an opportunity for us to model a new type of social structure that I believe, especially among younger generations, could be the entrance point for them to hear the gospel, to be part of the church. And in effect, change the way people are connecting. Because right now, especially because of the pandemic in the last 2 years, but with the internet and with social media and the way people are a lot of times they're supplementing their personal relationships with online media. And there's debate as to whether, I don't think they're getting rid of face-to-face connections, but they're augmenting, at minimum, those relationships with technology. But those younger generations are craving for good relationships. And right now the church does not offer them what they need. If we were to imagine if we created communities of people that were obviously loving Jesus, following Jesus, but that were demonstrating a whole new way of being able to live life together with others in meaningful ways and making a difference, which especially is important to younger generations. I think that there are younger people, once they get over their initial suspicions of what they believe about the church, I think would be really, really open to responding to this. Because as families break down and our society breaks down, the need for good, healthy relationships is bigger than ever. So yes, and that's what the church provided in the first few centuries. As the church faced its challenges in the early days of the Roman Empire, even though the oikos and oikoi existed, one of the hallmarks of the church in those centuries, and you go back and read some of the writers of the time, and I'm talking the secular writers who were observing the church, they would comment on things. In fact, they would say things. In fact, they used to criticize the Christians, and they thought they might have been incestuous or something because they were all calling each other brothers and sisters and wondering what these people were doing. And of course, they thought they were cannibals and they were eating body and blood and all this kind of stuff. But apart from that, there was something powerful of what was happening in those communities. Those oikoi became even stronger representations of a vision for something great and good that was attractive. And that was one of the things that drew people into the church. So, yes, 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 yes. I don't know why I wasn't preaching it, but, yeah.
I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
So the comment, the cereal thing. Well, no, my brother's got a Wheaties box with Michael Jordan on it. He's had it for years. It's kind of a thing, so just didn't know if you had one. That's not the question.
Okay.
The second.
We can talk about that later.
Okay. But the other part is, I see. I'm kind of fresh off the boat here and kind of new to the family, Church of God. But what I see is we're kind of positioned doctrinally, even theologically, to be sort of this ecumenical bridge. And how have you seen this oikos paradigm, reality, play out in reaching and reaching across denominational boundaries?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think that's good. Thank you. I think right now, just in general, as a general comment, and I totally agree with your sentiment on that, the importance of that. I think that's one of the ways that we see God at work is when we see that the movement is more. It's not just an isolated movement within a particular denomination, but begins to flourish all over the place. And I think that's one of the exciting pieces of this is that this reframing of the church is not just limited to any one. Nobody's got a corner on this. Everybody, God's doing this all over the place, and we're seeing it. I mean, really, this really began to take hold in Europe for the most part, and now is the U.S. typically, North America. We come onto these things late, but we're seeing this happen in a lot of different denominations, groups. I know that, for example, there's a significant example of this in England that goes back, in the last 20 years, that has been very influential in this way. And so, yeah, I think that is the case. And so what's happening is, as a result of that, as we're learning all this stuff, as we're needing to learn from each other, and we're learning across all these different lines. And so I don't think any, in fact, I would say that probably the good thing in all of this is that denominations, of course, within the Church of God, we're not a denomination, right? Right, okay, there you go. Anyway, I'll let you deal with that however you wish. But the point being is that denominations are resistant to this as structures, which then allows this to take place at the fringes. And all new movements start at the fringes, and that's a good thing. And at the fringes, I think that again, without getting into a long discussion, the Holy Spirit works on the fringes a lot, and the Holy Spirit is drawing together people of all sorts of stripes and brands and labels. So that's what I'm saying.
Yes, well, you're talking about the hub, and then of course you have the pods that are outside that, small groups. But it's also been my experience that those pods become made up of various denominations within that group. And they function very well. They're still loyal to their family church, and sometimes that can create some difficulty as far as private stress and so on. But I think it's important, and I think you would agree, and I think you covered that briefly, is that by leaving your theology at the door, if you're there to fellowship and study Scripture together and to pray together, that overcomes the crisis and distress that you might find in that group. However, I have noticed also that those groups become ecological, in that they are, if we had a function at First Church, they would all be there. If they had another function at, say, the Lutheran Church, they would all go to that. And so they were basically extending the family beyond that pod. And I think that's what you're saying, if I'm missing the point.
So is one of your concerns, just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, is one of your concerns that the danger is that by creating all these decentralized groups out there, there's a danger that they might go into directions that maybe as a church we're not comfortable with because we want bigger, tighter control over doctrine and other practices? Is that part of your concern?
It's not a concern really, I haven't been my experience, because
Okay.
for the most part, leadership has been sympathetic and supportive of that kind of a group. And there hasn't been that fear. And I haven't seen that where other, say the Lutheran or the Catholic or Pentecostal groups that are represented there, they don't seem to have a problem with either. But I can see that it possibly could become a problem if, depending on leadership, if you're insisting on specific structure, specific theology, then it becomes an issue.
So let me make a general comment that hopefully will address some of this. I think, and I had this discussion with someone at lunch as well, but I think here's a point, and that is, I mean, it fits into some of the other stuff I was saying, but we got to allow, if God's Spirit wants to do all sorts of things, we've got to be open to that, right? I mean, but I know we're always concerned, what if things go off the rails, and how do we maintain control, which is always a big word we love to, if not use, at least think of in the church. Here's one of the things I think that needs to happen in order for all of this to work. Because I know some of you are concerned about that, and that's a legitimate concern, but it's not just because of this model. That can happen in anything. And I think one of the things we really struggle with in the church is knowing how to have good accountability with leadership, as opposed to control. We resort to control because we're desperate and we feel like we have to rein things in. But if we have good relationships that are built on things like responsibility and accountability and healthy authority, that we can surmount those things, but we're not good at that. And I think that, to be honest, in the Church of God, we're particularly not good at that. So we have to find ways of working with developing leaders who are accountable. And then that requires a skill set, even of those of us who are in leadership, like as pastors and so forth. We've got to find better ways of working with our leaders who do empower and we do unleash to do work. But we've erred in one of two ways. We've either turned them loose and then wonder why they've gone off the rails, or we've overly controlled them and then we prevented them from doing God's work. So there's a balance there, and it really comes down to developing accountable relationships. So, what do you got? Have we done?
One more.
One more?
Wrap up with this one.
Okay.
Mr. Biarki. Now we can just remember what it was up next. I wanted to ask you about, I understand missional communities as a group of people who are coming together to accomplish something or to minister in a certain area and that kind of stuff. Is there room for the group of people that just kind of, we have a lot of this stuff in common and we just want to hang out?
Always good to hang out. So I mean, seriously, there's nothing wrong with that, but those things typically don't last.
That'd be more like a small group kind of thing.
Yeah, and fellowship groups are fine, but it goes back to what is our conviction of how the church functions. I know the underground uses that language, and you've heard Michael talk about this stuff as well. Is in the underground they talk about the ecclesial minimums. And in order to be recognized as one of their micro churches, you must be able to demonstrate that you are doing worship, community, which is basically community fellowship, or you would describe it, and basically ministry outside yourself. And they believe that's a healthy church has those three components. And I would think if a missional community is a microcosm of what God's church is to be, it must have those elements to a certain degree. So if it's just focused on the fellowship side of it, again, if they want to be a fellowship group, nobody would want to stop them. But it doesn't meet the marks of a body that truly is a microcosm of what the church should be. And this is what we're really trying to develop. So we want to, and because it'll devolve into koinonitis, which we're just all love each other, we're just stuck on each other, and that's it. And we've got to get beyond it. So, okay, I guess thank you. It's been good. I appreciate the time. And,
Excellent. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you, Lloyd, for taking the time to be here. We are blessed in Lloyd's transition that he and Kathy will be here in Central California. So let me just do a couple things in closing. Can you please take out your device, whatever device you happen to show up with, whether it's Apple or an Android. Would you please pull that out? Would you open up your web browser? I know some of you are looking at me and you're like, I'm not going to do it. But come on, please pull it out. Don't be stubborn. Come on. And then if you would, in your search engine, type in the address for Central California. That would be CHOG, CHOG, centralcal.org. It's on the screen behind me. If my spelling was too fast for you. CHOG, centralcal.org. Once you get there, on the mobile device, there's going to be usually in the upper right-hand corner, that little sandwich or hamburger, which is like a menu icon. If you click on that, there's going to be one there that talks about the discussion group tracks. I'd love for you to click there. And then I mentioned this earlier in the announcements that there were going to be 3 ways to take the things that we've been doing and carry some of this forward. And I think with the way that the questions are unpacking at a very practical level, I want to give you some steps to be able to take. CHOG, centralcal.org. That's our website for Central California. Then in the menu in the upper right-hand corner, one of the drop-down options will be discussion groups. If you're stuck, look for a younger person next to you, and they can help you take those next steps. In that, you're going to notice that there's a button to be able to register. If you wanted to register, you can click there. So go ahead and click on that button. That register button allows you to be able to put in your contact information. You can then type in your information. Hi, I'm Bob, and here's my email address. It's very non-invasive. We're not looking for your social security. But in there, you're going to be able to register for different discussion group tracks. One of them happens to be a discussion group for what Lloyd has been talking about, the decentralized church. We have the opportunity to have Lloyd on a weekly call for a bounded set of time, probably about 8 weeks, to be able to talk through this stuff. Instead of hearing from Lloyd, you're going to get to hear from him and interact with him like we would at the table. You're going to get to bring your very specifics and say, hey, can you help me think this through? Which is going to really help you to be able to problem solve. So you can choose that track and say, yes, I'd like to be in that one. There's also a Mars Hill discussion group. There was a podcast with 12 episodes released last year. That's another one you can choose, or you can say no to that. Nope, I only want to do the decentralized one. Or if you want to say both, I want to do both of those. There's another one called the Bible Project. That's going to be 7 weeks long, digging into 2 different theological topics. One, heaven and earth. The other one, kingdom of priests. And so we're going to dig into both of those topics because, again, those 2 topics have dramatic impact on all of these things that we've been talking about. So I've selected those 2 topics specifically because you're getting into the theology that will inform why we're even considering some of these things. So you can sign up for all of those or one of those. You're going to notice it doesn't have a specific day and time yet. That's because I'm looking to collect all of the interested people and then figure out when and where we can meet. This is not only open to pastors, so if you're a congregation member and you'd like to just jump into these conversations, they're completely open to you. I will have to apologize. There will probably be pastors on the call though, so you will have those folks to deal with there. If you would, I'd love you to take that step. You can submit that. Pastor Brandon Zoll has already signed up earlier in the day. Brownie points to you, my brother. All right. In my message last night, I talked about Paso Robles. I'm not going to give you the longer version, but the short version is that because of the end of a church, we now have the seedbed to launch more kingdom initiatives. And so the executive council doesn't have all of the tracks laid for this yet, but here's how I'd like to prime the pump with you. If you can think of ways to be able to establish greater temple ministry, or to increase the way that you're gathering, or to be able to do some more development with settlers. Some of you from last night will remember that language. Or, if you can, more on this side of the spectrum, look at ways to be able to launch a new home ministry, whether it's a missional community or whatever you want to call it. You want to do some scattered ministry, or there's some pioneers in the room that are thinking about projects. What we're wanting to do with these funds, we have something like $270,000 that is available to us. We're wanting to spur on ideas where you can say, if I had $2,000, I dare to dream this dream. If I had $15,000 to do this in the next couple of years, I would love to do that. We would like to be able to receive applications of projects, not just like, hey, Michael, you know me, can I have $2,000? No. You can't. But here's what I'd like to do. Here are the outcomes that I think this could produce, and we may fail. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. We're looking to be able to prime the pump with some skunk works ideas, like Lloyd talked about. So whether you're a church leader or a congregation member, if there's something that the Spirit of God might be bringing forth that would require your faith, but also some funds, we would love to be able to discover those things and be able to let the seedbed of that ministry launch some brand new initiatives. So think about that. You can email me about those ideas if you've got them in the meantime.